Jeff, can you tell me a little bit about asset protection and what it means to business owners?
Sure. Asset protection is organizing one's affairs and financial assets in advance of a problem, litigation, tax-wise, designed to protect those assets from potential creditor claims. As a caveat, it has nothing to do with hiding assets. It has everything to do with how you structure your assets prior to an issue coming up.
I just think asset protection really has applicability to a lot of people, really anyone who's looking to protect themselves from any future claims, whether it's negligence. Certainly when we think of asset protection when working with our clients, a lot of times we see it among professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, certainly concerns there. And then also corporate officers, directors, and fiduciaries. It also comes into play with people that own real estate. There may be future environmental claims on some of the properties that you own. So asset protection is a way to help protect against those claims as well. But again, it's a conversation that we need to be having with all of our clients about how things are titled, and also looking about ways if they need to take it a step farther.
That's a great point, because asset protection really could be bifurcated into personal assets and business assets. What do you think is the main difference, Jeff, and how would you handle that?
Well, when we talk about asset protection planning, there is a divergence, as you're referring to, between personal and business assets. Let's start with business assets. Typically, the issue that we're concerned about is the actual underlying assets inside the business. So as an example, we'd be looking at, say, intellectual property inside a business, which has great value to the enterprise itself. So we would be looking at strategies to protect those. So copyrights, trademarks, things like that are maybe somewhat obvious, but even things like non-solicitation agreements with employees, which would protect customer lists, non-compete agreements, things like that. Those are all asset protection issues for business assets. Another piece we would tend to look at is how is the entity itself structured? Does it make sense to spin off certain types of assets into separate LLCs or C Corps or S Corps? Each of those has different tax impacts inside those strategies, but there may be good, valid asset protection, asset preservation reasons which would cause us to suggest moving those assets around the balance sheet, so to speak.
Now, what do you think about it from the personal aspect side of it?
Well, the personal aspects are somewhat of a catch-all, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's talk about personal assets as those things that people hold outside the business itself. So the primary concern really is twofold. It's liability arising from the business and tax liability, either income tax liability or when someone passes away, actual estate tax liability. So when we talk to clients about those types of issues, we're much more focused on those assets that are typically outside of a business. So things like retirement accounts, investment accounts, real estate, boats, cars, things like that. Those aren't business assets typically. Right. They're something we're going to focus on that's outside the business.
And one of the other things that we really didn't talk about in terms of asset protection is marriage. Certainly, protecting your assets from a future spouse. And maybe perhaps if you own a business, it's also a family business. It's your children and protecting the marriage of your child in terms of protecting the assets within the family business. So I think it takes a broader applicability, when it comes to asset protection.
So what are some examples of some type of tools that you would put in place for asset protection planning?
So when we talk about on the personal side, typically we start with the basics, the things that exist that are you probably already taken advantage of that you don't know. So these are things like federal and state exemptions. Cash value life insurance, annuities, those are typically exempt under state law. Retirement plans, if they're what's known as ERISA qualified, they are protected under federal law. Contrasted with an IRA, an individual retirement account, which is protected under state law. Homestead exemptions, that's a state law exemption. There's a certain value of your home that is protected against potential creditor claims. These are assets that, for whatever reason, the state or federal government said, we want to make sure that if something catastrophic happens to a family or an individual, we're going to give them enough assets to give them a restart, so to speak, or not so much a head start, but a restart. We don't want to deplete them. We want to give them enough so they don't become wards of the state.
And would you say that the common problems that we see around asset protection, I think, are probably around issues where you, again, you commit to one planning strategy, or you think that because it may not work, you don't try or you don't explore it. And I think those were some of the things that we talked about previously, was just being open-minded to work with an estate planning expert and an asset protection expert to really educate you on what are the options available. Ultimately, it comes down to understanding what you want to accomplish, and really, what the risks are that you're trying to protect against.
Thanks. That's a great point, Lisa. And thank you, Jeff, for joining us today. And thank you, Lisa, for joining us. And thank you for joining us as well.